A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. But when a white cop spits in his face, thinking he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. The precinct was alive with noise. Phones rang, boots stomped against the tiled floor, and the scent of cheap coffee mixed with the faint musk of sweat and gunpowder. Officers leaned back in their chairs, swapping stories about last night's arrests, their laughter bouncing off the walls. It was just another morning in the station, until he walked in. Michael Grant stepped through the glass doors, his presence going unnoticed at first. He didn't wear a badge, no uniform, nothing to distinguish him from the civilians who occasionally wandered in with complaints. Just a plain button-up shirt, dark jeans, and a calm, observant gaze. He scanned the room, his expression unreadable. A junior officer, Kevin Harris, caught sight of him from across the room. There was something about the man that made Kevin pause. He wasn't dressed like someone who belonged here, but there was no nervousness in his stance, no hesitation in his steps. His posture was composed, his eyes sharp, like a man who had spent years commanding respect. Kevin frowned, trying to place where he had seen him before, but the thought slipped away as the laughter of his colleagues drew his attention back to their conversation. At the center of that group was Ryan Matthews, a veteran officer with a reputation for being both arrogant and aggressive. He leaned against his desk, boots propped up, arms crossed, watching the world around him with the certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had been at this precinct for years, long enough to know that power didn't come from a title. It came from fear, from control, from making sure everyone knew their place. And to him, this unknown black man standing in the middle of his station was clearly out of place. Ryan pushed off his desk, walking towards Michael with slow, deliberate steps. The room didn't go silent, but there was a subtle shift. Conversations quieted just enough for people to listen in, eyes flicking toward the encounter, without making it obvious. Michael remained still, his gaze steady as Ryan approached. "You lost, buddy?" Ryan asked, his voice thick with condescension. Michael didn't flinch, just observing. Ryan let out a short, mocking laugh. "Observing, huh? Well, you can do that from outside." His smirk widened as he glanced around at his colleagues. "Unless you're here to file a complaint?" A few officers chuckled under their breath, but no one spoke up. Michael didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of flinching or looking away. His silence unsettled Ryan more than he cared to admit. There was something off about this guy, something he couldn't put his finger on. But Ryan was used to handling men like this, the ones who thought they could walk in like they belonged, like they were equal. He stepped closer, invading Michael's space, his presence radiating authority. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Ryan spat at his feet. A hush fell over the room. The casual air that had filled the precinct moments ago evaporated. Some officers stiffened, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kevin's stomach twisted, a cold wave of unease washing over him. Michael lowered his gaze, looking at the small glob of spit that had landed just inches from his shoe. Ryan smirked, folding his arms over his chest. "Boys like you don't belong here." Michael exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. Then, with the same calm he had carried since stepping through the doors, he reached into his pocket. Kevin's breath caught. Was he reaching for a weapon? Ryan tensed, his fingers twitching toward his holster. But Michael didn't pull out a gun. Instead, he retrieved something small, something metallic, a badge. And when he turned it over, the engraved words caught the light, silencing the entire room. Police Chief Michael Grant. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The laughter, the idle chatter, the casual air of authority that had surrounded Ryan Matthews, all of it vanished in an instant. The badge in Michael Grant's hand gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the words Police Chief standing out like a slap to the face. The room, once filled with easy confidence and careless power, now felt suffocatingly silent. Officers who had smirked moments before now shifted uneasily in their chairs. A few of them looked at each other, as if silently confirming that they had all seen the same thing. Ryan, however, didn't move. His jaw clenched, his smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back. He let out a short, disbelieving chuckle, shaking his head. "This some kind of joke?" he scoffed, though his voice lacked the usual arrogance. Michael's expression remained unreadable. He slowly tucked his badge back into his pocket, then looked Ryan directly in the eye. "No joke." His voice was calm, level, but there was something beneath it, something steady and unshakable. "You just spat on your commanding officer." A murmur spread through the room, low but growing. Kevin's eyes darted between Michael and Ryan, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. He had heard rumors about a new chief being appointed, but no one had expected this. And certainly, no one had expected the new chief to introduce himself this way. Ryan's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his pride warring with the sinking realization that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But years of dominance, years of knowing he held power in this station, weren't so easily shaken. He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. "You walk in here, dressed like that, and expect us to believe you're the new chief?" He let out another laugh, but this time, no one joined him. "Where's your uniform, huh? Where's the press, the mayor, the commissioner? They always make a big deal when a new chief takes over." Michael didn't blink. "I didn't come here for a press conference. I came to see who you all really are when you don't think someone important is watching." Another wave of tension rippled through the room. Some officers lowered their gazes. Others stole cautious glances at Ryan, waiting to see how he would react. Ryan scoffed, shaking his head again, but the usual confidence wasn't there. He could feel the shift. He could feel the control slipping from his grasp. Michael took a step closer, his voice quieter now, but carrying even more weight. "And I saw exactly what I needed to see." Ryan opened his mouth, ready to throw back some kind of defense. But before he could speak, Michael turned to the room. His gaze swept over the officers, and suddenly, no one wanted to meet his eyes. "How many of you watched that happen?" Michael asked, his tone deceptively soft. No one answered. Michael let the silence stretch, making sure they felt the weight of it. "How many of you thought it was funny?" A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stayed perfectly still, as if hoping that by not moving, they wouldn't be called out. Michael nodded slowly, as if their silence was answer enough. Then he turned back to Ryan. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Ryan lifted his chin, his pride still intact, even as the ground beneath him crumbled. "Damn right." Michael hummed, as if considering that. "And in all that time, how many people like me have walked through those doors as your superior?" Ryan's jaw tightened, his silence speaking louder than words. Michael nodded again. "That's what I thought." He glanced around the room once more before stepping back. "You think you run this place, that your uniform, your years here, your connections, make you untouchable. But you just learned something today, Officer Matthews." Ryan swallowed hard, but still held his ground. "And what's that?" Michael's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped just enough to send a chill through the air. "That I'm not afraid of men like you." The words hit like a hammer. A few officers sucked in quiet breaths. Kevin felt a shiver run down his spine. Ryan, for the first time in a long time, had no response. Michael let the silence hang a moment longer before turning toward the rest of the precinct. "We start fresh today," he announced, his voice firm and steady. "And let me make one thing clear. This department will be different. There will be accountability. There will be change." His gaze flickered back to Ryan. "And there will be consequences." Ryan's fingers twitched at his sides, but he said nothing. He knew better now. Michael held his stare for a moment longer before stepping away, his posture calm, collected, utterly in control. Ryan had walked into this encounter thinking he was the one with power. Ryan had walked into this encounter thinking he was the one with power. But now, as Michael Grant walked past him, as the room's attention followed the new chief instead of him, as the weight of his actions settled in his gut, Ryan realized he had never been more wrong. The silence in the precinct was thick, suffocating. Ryan Matthews stood frozen, his face tight with suppressed anger. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. For years he had commanded respect, not through honor, but through fear. The younger officers looked up to him. The older ones tolerated him, and the ones who didn't agree with his methods simply stayed silent. That was how things worked. But now, in front of all of them, he had been put in his place. By a man he had assumed was beneath him. By a man who, in the span of minutes, had taken complete control of the room without raising his voice or throwing a single punch. Michael Grant hadn't just humiliated him. He had dismantled the entire foundation Ryan had built for himself in this precinct. And Ryan wasn't the type to let something like that slide. Michael turned, beginning to walk toward the captain's office, his posture calm, assured. It was over. He had made his point. But Ryan, his pride, his ego, his desperation, wouldn't let it end there. "Hold on." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like the snap of a whip. Michael stopped but didn't turn. The tension in the room spiked. A few officers exchanged wary glances, as if silently warning Ryan not to push his luck. But Ryan didn't care. His authority, his dominance, it was slipping through his fingers. He had to take it back. "You think you can just walk in here, throw your weight around, and expect us all to fall in line?" Ryan stepped forward, forcing his voice to stay steady, to mask the uncertainty creeping into his gut. "I don't care what your badge says. Respect isn't something you get just because you walked in with a title." Michael finally turned, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence alone made Ryan's words feel small. Ryan clenched his jaw, doubling down. "You want to prove you belong here? Fine. Let's see what you've got." Michael raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And how exactly do you suggest I do that?" Ryan's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A test," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "You're the big boss now, right? Let's see if you can actually do the job. Or are you just here to make speeches?" The challenge hung in the air. Officers who had been silent before now looked between the two men. Their interest peaked. The tension had shifted. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was a power struggle, one that everyone was now invested in. Kevin, standing on the edge of the group, swallowed hard. He had seen Ryan do this before, set someone up, back them into a corner, make them prove themselves on his terms. It was his way of maintaining control, of making sure everyone knew who really ran things. Michael studied Ryan for a moment. Then, To everyone's surprise, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made your stomach twist, that made you realize you might have just made a very big mistake. "All right," Michael said. "What do you have in mind?" Ryan's smirk widened. "A call just came in," he said, jerking his head toward the dispatch screen. "Disturbance at a local bar. Drunk guy refusing to leave, getting aggressive. Should be a routine call, but if you want to prove you belong here, why don't you handle it yourself?" Michael didn't blink. "Alone?" Ryan shrugged, feigning innocence. "You're the chief. You can do whatever you want. But if you want our respect, let's see you handle it the way we do." Michael let the words sit for a moment. Then he nodded. "Fine," he said simply. "Let's go." The room murmured in surprise. Some officers looked skeptical, others amused. They had expected him to refuse, to pull rank, to remind Ryan who was in charge. But instead, he was walking right into it. Ryan's smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. "All right then." He turned to the other officers. "Let's move." Within minutes, they were in their patrol cars, heading toward the scene. The ride was quiet, the tension thick between them. Michael sat in the passenger seat of Ryan's cruiser, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. Ryan, gripping the wheel tightly, kept sneaking glances at him, waiting for some sign of nervousness, some crack in the calm facade. But there was nothing. When they arrived at the bar, the scene was exactly what dispatch had reported. A man in his 40s, drunk and belligerent, shouting at the staff and shoving anyone who got too close. Ryan leaned against the car, crossing his arms. "All right, Chief," he said mockingly. "Let's see what you've got." Michael didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, walking toward the man with the same steady composure he had carried since the moment he walked into the precinct. The drunk turned, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" Michael didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, assessing, waiting. Then, without raising his voice, without any aggression, he said, "I think you've had enough for tonight." The man sneered, stumbling slightly. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Ryan and the other officers watched, waiting for Michael to make a mistake, to escalate, to react, to prove that he was just another outsider who didn't belong in their world. But Michael just kept looking at the man, his expression unreadable. Then he took a step closer and said, in a voice so calm it was almost chilling, "You don't want this to go the way you think it will." Something in his tone cut through the man's drunken haze. His bravado faltered, his body tensing. For a moment, he seemed to consider pushing further. But then, as if some primal instinct took over, he stepped back. "Fine," the man muttered. "I'm leaving." He turned and stumbled away, disappearing into the night. The officers watching were silent. Ryan, for the first time, had no words. Michael turned back to them, his expression unreadable. "Anything else?" Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing. Michael nodded. "Let's go." And just like that, he walked past them, returning to the car. Ryan stayed behind for a moment, his hands clenched into fists. He had set a trap. And somehow, Michael Grant had walked right through it, without ever touching the ground. The ride back to the precinct was eerily quiet. No smug remarks from Ryan, no sidelong glances from the other officers. Just the low hum of the engine and the weight of something unspoken settling over the car. Michael Grant sat in the passenger seat, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He had walked into Ryan's trap, stepped right into the fire, and somehow he hadn't even flinched. Ryan had expected him to fail, to escalate, to prove that he didn't belong. But instead, he had handled the situation with nothing more than presence, control, and a quiet authority that had stripped away any room for doubt. Ryan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had spent years building his dominance in that precinct, making sure that he was the one officers looked to, the one they feared, the one they respected. And now, in the span of one night, this man had walked in and shattered everything. By the time they pulled into the station, a small crowd of officers had already gathered. Word had spread fast. They had expected Michael to fail. They had expected to see the cracks. But now, as he stepped out of the car, all eyes were on him in a different way. Michael took his time. He looked around, meeting their gazes one by one. Some looked away. Others held his stare, but with newfound caution. The entire dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. Then, he turned to Ryan. "Anything else?" he asked, his tone calm, almost casual. Ryan clenched his jaw. His mind raced for something, anything to claw back the power he had just lost. But there was nothing. Michael had beaten him, without threats, without shouting, without lifting a single finger. Ryan exhaled sharply through his nose. "You got lucky tonight," he muttered. Michael tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smirk, he said, "No, Matthews, I didn't." The words hit harder than any insult, because deep down, Ryan knew it was true. Behind them, Kevin and the other officers watched, waiting for what would happen next. For years, Ryan had been the loudest voice in the room, the one who dictated the rules, even when they weren't written. But now, the silence stretching between him and Michael was deafening. Then Michael spoke again, his voice carrying through the precinct. "I told you all earlier that today is the start of something new." He glanced around. "But let me be clear. This isn't about me. It's about this department, about the people we serve. This uniform, this badge, it's not a weapon. It's a responsibility." His gaze locked onto Ryan's. "And if you can't understand that, you don't belong here." The air shifted. A ripple of something unspoken passed through the crowd. Some officers nodded, others looked uncertain, but no one laughed, no one sneered. The authority in the room had changed hands, and it was undeniable. Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to fight back, to throw one last jab, but it was over. He could see it in the faces around him. For the first time in years, they weren't looking at him. They were looking at Michael Grant, and they were listening. Michael gave him one last look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into his office. The precinct had a new leader, and nothing would ever be the same. Ryan Matthews stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. For years he had commanded this precinct with an iron grip, ruling through intimidation, unspoken threats, and the quiet compliance of those around him. But now, in the span of a single night, all of that had crumbled. The power he had built wasn't just slipping through his fingers. It was gone. The other officers didn't speak, but their silence said everything. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one laughed at his jokes. No one looked to him for what to do next. They were still adjusting, still processing the undeniable shift in the air. Kevin Harris watched from the sidelines, his stomach twisted in knots. He had always known Ryan was dangerous, not in the way criminals were, but in the way unchecked power could rot a system from the inside. But seeing him like this, standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance, Kevin realized something. Ryan wasn't feared anymore. He was exposed. A door swung open, and Michael Grant stepped back into the room. The quiet murmurs stopped instantly. His presence alone was enough to command the space, but he didn't gloat, didn't revel in his victory. Instead, He held up a single sheet of paper. "Ryan Matthews," Michael said evenly, his voice carrying across the precinct. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." A murmur spread through the room, shock mixing with an odd sense of inevitability. Ryan's eyes darkened, his nostrils flaring. "You can't do that," he hissed. Michael didn't flinch. "I just did." A tense beat of silence stretched between them. Then Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. But there was no real fight left in him. He turned and stormed toward the exit, shoving past officers who barely moved aside. The doors slammed behind him. Michael exhaled slowly, then looked around at the gathered officers. "For those of you who have been waiting for change," he said, "it starts now." And this time, when he walked away, no one dared to question his authority. The precinct was different now. It wasn't just the silence that had changed. It was the way people stood, the way they looked at each other, the way they looked at him. Michael Grant hadn't just walked into a hostile environment. He had faced it head-on and left no room for doubt about who was in charge. Kevin Harris watched from his desk as the new police chief moved through the station, his presence no longer questioned, no longer ignored. The weight of the night still lingered in the air, but something else had settled in, too. Something Kevin hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Michael stopped near the exit, glancing back at the room one last time. His gaze swept over the officers, landing on the ones who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, and finally, the ones who had realized change was inevitable. "You don't have to like me," he said, "but you will respect the badge you wear." Then, without another word, he pushed the door open and walked out, leaving behind a precinct that would never be the same again. Somewhere in the room, an officer exhaled quietly. Someone else muttered, "Damn." And Kevin, still sitting at his desk, couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time in years, the right man was in charge. What do you think? Should Ryan Matthews have faced a harsher punishment, or was his downfall enough? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. Change is coming. Make sure you don't miss it.